What happens when a beloved actor sits down for what should be a friendly chat and ends up walking off set in front of millions of viewers? In just 49 seconds of unfiltered commentary, one host turned a casual interview into career-defining chaos. Nicholas Ralph arrived at the Loose Women studio that morning, expecting the usual lighthearted banter. The All Creatures Great and Small star had been making the rounds promoting the new series, and this was supposed to be another easy stop on the press tour. But from the moment he settled into his seat across from the panel, something felt different. The energy was off. Denise Welch sat front and center with that unmistakable look in her eye, the one regular viewers know all too well. She was ready for confrontation. The show opened normally enough. Ruth Langsford smiled warmly at the camera, welcoming viewers back from the commercial break. Janet Street Porter shuffled her notes. Colleen Nolan laughed at something off camera. Everything seemed fine. Then Denise leaned forward. "So, Nicholas, lovely to have you here," she began, her voice dripping with a sweetness that immediately felt forced. "Tell us, how does it feel to be on a show that actually matters compared to those little period dramas you do?" The other panelists froze. Ruth's smile faltered. Janet's eyes widened. Colleen stopped mid-laugh. Nicholas, ever the professional, kept his composure. "Well, I think all shows matter to the people who love them," he replied calmly. "Our viewers are incredibly passionate, and that means everything to us." It was a perfect deflection. Gracious, humble, exactly what you'd expect from someone who grew up in the public eye. But Denise wasn't finished. "Oh, come on, be honest," she pressed, waving her hand dismissively. "Those costume dramas are just for people who have nothing better to do on a Sunday night. Real television, real conversation, that's what we do here. Don't you think?" Ruth tried to interject. "Denise, I think what Nicholas does is wonderful. My mother absolutely loves that show." But Denise talked right over her. "I'm just saying, there's a difference between real entertainment and these shows that put people to sleep. Nicholas, you're a smart guy. You must know that." Nicholas shifted in his seat. His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I think you might be surprised by how many people connect with the stories we tell. They're about community, compassion, and finding light in difficult times. Those themes resonate with a lot of folks." "Themes," Denise repeated, practically spitting the word. "That's such an actor thing to say. Themes. What about reality? What about addressing real issues that matter to real people right now?" Janet finally jumped in, sensing the tension rising. "I think Nicholas has a point, though. Not everything has to be confrontational to be meaningful. Sometimes people just want to escape for an hour." "Escape," Denise scoffed. "That's exactly the problem with this country. Everyone wants to escape instead of facing what's actually happening. We sit here every day tackling the hard topics, the uncomfortable conversations, and shows like his just let people stick their heads in the sand." The audience had gone completely silent. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was an attack. Nicholas took a slow breath, clearly trying to maintain his composure. "With respect, I don't think offering people comfort during challenging times is the same as ignoring reality," he said. "Different kinds of programming serve different purposes. There's room for both." "Is there, though?" Denise leaned back, arms crossed. "Because it seems to me like we've got too many people living in Fantasyland and not enough willing to have difficult conversations. Maybe if people watched less of your countryside nostalgia and more shows with substance, we'd be in a better place as a society." Colleen tried to lighten the mood. "Oh, Denise, come on now. Now, I love a good period drama. There's nothing wrong with a bit of escapism." But Denise rounded on her, too. "That's because you're not willing to challenge yourself, Colleen. None of you are. You all just want everything nice and pleasant and comfortable." Ruth's professional facade was cracking. "Denise, that's not fair. We tackle plenty of serious topics on this show." "When it's convenient," Denise shot back. when it doesn't upset anyone, when we can all still go to lunch afterward and pretend we're best friends. Nicholas had heard enough. He sat up straighter, his voice taking on an edge that hadn't been there before. I'm sorry, but I don't think you get to decide what has value and what doesn't. The letters I get from viewers who found comfort in our show during illness, grief, isolation, they tell me we're doing something meaningful. Maybe it's not your cup of tea, and that's absolutely fine. But dismissing it entirely feels needlessly cruel. Cruel? Denise's voice rose. You want to talk about cruel? I'll tell you what's cruel. Actors like you swanning around pretending you're doing important work, when really you're just cashing checks and playing dress-up. Meanwhile, some of us are out here trying to make actual change, having actual conversations that matter. The entire set had gone ice cold. Ruth looked horrified. Janet was shaking her head. Colleen's mouth hung open. And Nicholas, sweet, patient Nicholas, who had sat through 15 minutes of escalating insults with grace and professionalism, had finally reached his limit. Right, he said quietly, reaching up to unclip his microphone. I don't need to sit here and be insulted. Oh, here we go, Denise laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Can't handle a bit of honest criticism? This is exactly what I'm talking about. You people live in your little bubble where everyone tells you how wonderful you are, and the second someone challenges you, you fall apart. Nicholas stood up, carefully placing his microphone on the chair. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but firm. There's a difference between honest criticism and being deliberately unkind. I came here to talk about a show I'm proud of, with a cast and crew who work incredibly hard. I didn't come here to be your punching bag because you've decided you're somehow superior to everyone else in television. Superior? Denise stood too now, her voice getting louder. I'm just the only one willing to tell the truth. Everyone else tippy-toes around you, celebrities, afraid to say what they really think. Well, I'm not afraid. Your show is boring. Your acting is mediocre. And this whole humble nice guy act you've got going is probably as fake as everything else. Ruth stood up, trying to physically position herself between them. Denise, that's enough. Nicholas, I'm so sorry. This has gotten completely out of hand. But Nicholas wasn't looking at Ruth. He was looking directly at Denise, and something in his expression had shifted. The patience was gone. The politeness had evaporated. What remained was simple, honest anger. You know what I think? He said, his voice steady but cold. I think you mistake cruelty for honesty. I think you've convinced yourself that being harsh makes you brave. But really, you're just mean, and hiding behind this idea that you're some truth teller doesn't change that. Denise's face flushed red. How dare you come on my show and speak to me like that? Your show? Janet interjected. Denise, this is all of our show. But Denise ignored her, keeping her focus locked on Nicholas. You need to apologize right now. You can't talk to me that way. Do you know who I am? Nicholas actually laughed at that, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. Yes, I know exactly who you are. You're someone who's built a career on controversy and is now so addicted to it that you can't have a normal conversation anymore. You have to turn everything into a fight because that's the only way you know how to stay relevant. The studio audience gasped. This was unprecedented. Guests didn't talk back like this. They certainly didn't dismantle hosts on their own show. But Nicholas wasn't finished. I've sat here for nearly 20 minutes while you've insulted my work, my colleagues, my integrity, and even my sincerity. And for what? Because I'm on a show you personally don't enjoy? Because I wouldn't engage with your attempts to start an argument? That says a lot more about you than it does about me. Colleen stood up too now, trying to inject some calm. Listen, everyone, let's just take a breath here. This doesn't need to get any worse. It's already worse, Nicholas said, not unkindly, but firmly. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend otherwise. I've been nothing but respectful since I arrived. I answered every question. I tried to engage genuinely, and I've been met with nothing but condescension and hostility. Denise pointed a finger at him. You're too sensitive. This is live television. If you can't handle it, go back to your little pretend farm and play dress up with the cows. That was it. That was the line. Nicholas picked up his phone from the table, slid it into his pocket, and looked at Ruth. Thank you for having me, he said, his tone returning to something approaching civility. I'm sorry it turned out this way. Ruth nodded, looking devastated. Nicholas, you don't have to go. Please, let's just move on to something else. But he was already walking, not storming off in a huff, not making a dramatic scene. Just walking, with dignity, with his head held high, like someone who knew his worth and refused to be diminished. Yeah, run away, Denise called after him. That's what people like you do when you can't handle real conversation. Nicholas stopped at the edge of the set and turned back one last time. No, Denise, this isn't real conversation. Real conversation requires mutual respect. It requires actually listening to the other person instead of just waiting for your turn to attack. You don't want conversation. You want combat. And I'm not interested. And with that, he was gone. Disappeared through the side door while cameras were still rolling, leaving 4 panelists and a studio full of shocked audience members in his wake. Ruth tried to regain control. Well, that was, unexpected. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back... But Denise interrupted her. Good riddance, honestly. If he can't handle a bit of back and forth, he shouldn't be in this industry. Janet turned to her, incredulous. A bit of back and forth? Denise, you attacked everything about him from the moment he sat down. What did you expect would happen? I expected him to be professional, Denise snapped. He was professional, Colleen said quietly. He was professional for far longer than most people would have been. You were out of line, Denise. Way out of line. Oh, so now you're all turning on me. Denise looked around at her fellow panelists. This is unbelievable. I'm the only one with the backbone to say what everyone else is thinking, and you're making me the villain? Ruth's voice was ice cold when she responded. No one was thinking those things, Denise. That was all you. And honestly, I'm embarrassed. For you. For us. For the show. Remember, that was cruel and unnecessary. Well, maybe if people weren't so thin-skinned, Denise started, but Janet cut her off. Stop. Just stop. You don't get to blame him for this. You pushed and pushed until he had no choice but to leave. And you know what? Good for him. He stood up for himself with more grace than you showed him during this entire interview. The audience erupted in applause. Not polite, obligatory applause, but real, enthusiastic support for what Janet had just said. Denise looked around, seeming to realize for the first time that the room wasn't on her side. This is ridiculous, she muttered. Ruth turned to the camera, her professional smile back in place, but not quite reaching her eyes. We need to take a break. We'll be right back. As soon as they cut to commercial, the set exploded. Producers rushed in. More other panelists started talking over each other. And somewhere, just outside the building, Nicholas Ralph climbed into his car, took a deep breath, and drove away from one of the most dramatic talk show moments in recent memory. He had arrived as a guest. He left as a hero. Not because he'd lost his temper or made a scene, but because he'd done something so many people wish they could do when faced with a bully. He'd stood up, called it what it was, and walked away with his dignity intact. Inside the studio, Denise sat at the panel table, arms still crossed, insisting to anyone who would listen that she'd done nothing wrong, that she was just being honest, that people were too sensitive these days. But her fellow panelists weren't buying it anymore. You can't treat people like that, Ruth said firmly. Her voice low so nearby cameras wouldn't pick it up. He was a guest. He came here in good faith, and you ambushed him. I didn't ambush anyone, Denise protested. I asked legitimate questions about the value of his work. No, Colleen corrected. You insulted him repeatedly and called it honesty. There's a difference. Janet nodded in agreement. You went after him personally, Denise. His acting, his sincerity, even his character. That wasn't about having a different opinion. That was about tearing someone down for no reason. But Denise wouldn't budge, even as the evidence of what she'd done played out on monitors around the studio, even as producers huddled in concerned groups, even as her fellow panelists made it clear they didn't support her actions. She refused to see herself as anything but the truth teller in the situation. The break ended. They came back on air. Ruth steered the show towards safer topics, but the damage was done. The moment had been captured. Millions of viewers had watched it unfold in real time. And Nicholas Ralph, the quiet actor from the countryside drama, had become an unlikely symbol of standing up to bullying with grace under pressure. What had started as a routine promotional interview had become something else entirely. A masterclass in maintaining composure under attack. A demonstration of knowing when enough is enough. And a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to participate in someone else's cruelty. Nicholas didn't shout. He didn't throw things. He didn't make threats or issue ultimatums. He just recognized that he deserved better than what he was being offered, and he acted accordingly. He stood up and walked away. And in doing so, he showed everyone watching exactly what self-respect looks like. The interview that was meant to promote a television show became about something much bigger. About boundaries, about dignity, about the difference between honest discussion and targeted harassment, and about what happens when someone who spent their career being kind and professional finally says no. Denise had expected him to fold, to laugh it off, to play along with her aggressive style because that's what guests do. They smile through the discomfort because they need the publicity. They take the hits because it's part of the game, but Nicholas changed the rules. He decided his self-worth was more important than any promotional opportunity. And that decision, made in real time on live television, resonated with people in a profound way. Because how many of us have sat in meetings or conversations where we've been diminished? How many times have we smiled and nodded while someone treated us poorly, telling ourselves it's fine, it's just their style, we're being too sensitive? Nicholas showed another option. He showed that leaving is allowed, that you don't have to accept poor treatment just because someone frames it as honesty or humor or their authentic self. The panel moved through the rest of the show on autopilot. They discussed the topics they'd planned, took calls from viewers, did their usual segments. But the energy had shifted. Denise was quieter than usual, though still defensive when the topic circled back to what had happened. Ruth was visibly frustrated. Her normally unflappable demeanor cracked. Janet and Colleen exchanged meaningful looks that spoke volumes about conversations they'd be having once the cameras stopped rolling. And through it all, the phones in the control room wouldn't stop ringing. Viewers calling in, social media exploding. Everyone had an opinion about what they'd just witnessed. The overwhelming majority sided with Nicholas. They'd watched him try to be gracious. They'd seen him deflect and redirect. They'd witnessed him give Denise multiple opportunities to dial it back. And they'd watched her refuse every single one. When someone finally asks too much, when kindness is mistaken for weakness and patience is seen as permission to push further, something has to give. For Nicholas Ralph, that something was his willingness to stay in a situation where he wasn't being respected. He didn't owe Denise his presence. He didn't owe the show his endurance. He didn't owe anyone the right to treat him poorly for entertainment value. So he left. Simply, quietly, definitively. And in those 49 seconds between standing up and walking out that door, he created a moment that would be replayed and discussed for days to come. Not because it was scandalous or shocking in the traditional sense, but because it was real. It was honest. It was someone drawing a line and meaning it. The credits rolled. The show ended. The audience filed out. And Nicholas Ralph was already miles away, probably fielding calls from his publicist, maybe laughing about it with friends, so possibly just sitting in silence processing what had happened. But wherever he was, whatever he was doing it with his integrity intact. And that, in the end, was worth more than any interview could ever be.